Good morning, everyone, and welcome to the second session of our seminar, History and Education in the Early Modern Period, Spinoza and Beyond. We are truly delighted to have with us today Professor Michael Rosenthal from the University of Toronto. Professor Rosenthal has extensively studied Spinoza's political thought and its relationship with Jewish philosophy, publishing numerous articles in leading international journals. Among his works, I would like to mention Spinoza's Theological Political Treatise, a critical guide, published by Cambridge University Press. On a personal note, I would also like to express my gratitude for his article, Why Spinoza Chose the Hebrews, the exemplary function of prophecy in the Theological Political Treatise, published in History of Political Thought in 1997, which has been a key reference for much of my own research. Today, Professor Rosenthal will present a talk entitled Moral Education and the History of the First Men. So, since we are all eager to hear his presentation, I will now gladly give him the floor.
Thank you very much, Marta and Alessio, and all of the society for inviting me to give a talk, and I'm happy to do it. I just want to say that I just written this paper. It's a little bit rough, I think, in some places, but hopefully with your questions and critical responses, I can make it better. I'm hoping that you all have access to the handout at this point, partly because I'm going to refer to quite a few passages, about 10 passages in the course of the paper. So I think it would be useful to see. I apologize that everything's in English, and in some cases I put the Latin in there, but other cases I didn't. I was just trying to get this done. But hopefully you'll be able to make sense of what's going on, and we can use that as a way to talk about some of the texts and see if the argument I'm making makes any sense to you. Okay. So, excuse me. Let's start with a story from Scripture. In chapter 2 of the Theological Political Treatise, the TTP, Spinoza reminds us that in the book of Exodus, chapter 32, verse 4, that Scripture recounts that just as God had summoned Moses to Mount Sinai with the express purpose of revealing himself to the Israelites, they were at the base of the mountain making a golden calf to worship. So Moses is up there, the Israelites are down there worshiping the golden calf. According to Spinoza, this is passage 1 on the handout, even though God was revealed to the Israelites, they knew almost nothing about him. The Israelites, still steeped in Egyptian superstition, were uneducated, rudists. Moses did try to teach them, docuerit, but he did not teach them as a philosopher would, but rather as what Spinoza says, a legislature, how a legislature would, who offers them a way of living based on the law with its prohibitions and commandments. As Spinoza comments, Moses, quote, taught them in the same way that parents usually do children who are lacking in all reason, unquote. Now, whereas the Old Testament suggests that we can learn in this way, that is, through commandments and prohibitions, to repent and overcome sin, the New Testament, for example, Paul's letter to the Romans, claims that it's not the law, but only, quote, this is in chapter 2 also of the TTP, quote, special calling. It's only the special calling and grace of God, unquote, that makes it possible for us to overcome the temptations of the flesh. And then thirdly, Spinoza has another possibility of education in mind. Through freedom of mind, or through reason, or through natural light, all these terms I think are kind of used interchangeably in the TTP, we can, quote, live well. Now, the point of this discussion for Spinoza in chapter 2 is to provide evidence for Spinoza's claim that revelation is always accommodated to the epistemic level of the audience. But for our purposes today, it could equally well serve to provide a typology of different meanings of the word to educate in Spinoza's system of morality. So here we go. Before Sinai, right, the Israelites were completely ignorant. Whatever beliefs they held consisted in the imitation of the practices of their masters, right? That is what they learned in Egypt. Moses, after having encountered God at Sinai, educated them through the claim that they were not to follow the pseudo system of images that they had had before. At Sinai, he received a system of divine commands that was intended for the Israelite people, right? So that's kind of the rude Israelites. Then they get Moses, who through revelation gives them a system of commandments. The next step would be Paul, who argues that such commandments are ultimately inefficacious, and it's only through divine grace that moral learning can take place. And I think the whole account of Paul is very complicated, so I just want to note that. But he's quite clear that Paul says that it's a special grace that allows the people to be educated. And then after that, a philosopher, though, wouldn't be satisfied with any of these ways of education. The philosopher would not require tutelage from a wise parent like Moses, speaking for God, or God's special aid, as Paul seems to suggest. Rather, a philosopher would be able to overcome temptation through reason alone. Although some figures in Scripture, like Solomon, appear to have grasped this insight, Spinoza thinks that even then they were lacking in some way. Solomon taught, quote, that all goods of fortune are hollow for mortals, that men have nothing more excellent than the intellect, and that there's no greater punishment for men than folly. These all seem consistent with what reason teaches. But yet Solomon also believed himself in some ways, as Spinoza points out, to be above the law, and he indulged himself in sensual pleasures. In other words, he undermines his own philosophical vocation in a variety of ways. It's only with the advent, arguably, of Spinoza's own philosophical system, with its critique of explicit theology and the remnants of theology in philosophical systems of his time, it's only with Spinoza's system that we can become truly educated through self-directed demonstrative reason. So Spinoza kind of presents himself as the culmination in some ways of this process. Now, this reading of Spinoza, like the reading of Scripture itself on which it's based, constitutes a kind of narrative. It's based on the conceit of moral progress, which follows upon intellectual progress. In other words, as my level of understanding increases, so too does my moral power. It begins in slavish imaginative imitation, and it ends in autonomous rational self-direction. And then crucially, the desire to share our rational discoveries with others. And Spinoza points to proposition 37 of part 4 of the Ethics, where he says that rational people have a desire to share their knowledge with other people as well. So it seems to be a kind of model of education. Now, the problem with this narrative, though, I think, is that it's based, and I think Spinoza is aware of this, is that it's based on an overestimation of our power as human beings. At each point in the scriptural account, it appears in this narrative of progress that some sort of moral progress is possible through education. Yet each time, that apparent progress is undermined, at least to some degree. Right, so let's go through. So now we're going to go back to the story again and show how the education at various points, at least at each level of the system, seems to fail, even at the level of philosophical education. Sorry, I'm just dealing with the end of a cough here. The Israelites are apparently educated by Moses in the desert, but they're not really enlightened, Spinoza seems to suggest, but only manipulated to some degree through a more refined set of images. After all, Moses is a prophet who understands things in terms of the imagination and not through reason. Now, Solomon appears to arrive at a rational grasp of nature, and again, in this narrative that Spinoza gives us, but he's, as we said, betrays it through his own selfish motives. And Paul rejected the framework of Jewish law and brings us through Christ closer to the divine mind. But as we see, in the end, he also kind of hesitates. He goes back and forth. Sometimes he seems to talk as if he's a philosopher, and other times he refers to kind of supernatural claims about the nature of Christ, right? It seems to be that it's through divine grace. And later in another passage, the resurrection, the belief in the resurrection, the miraculous resurrection of Christ that allows God to intervene, as it were, and transform us from immoral to moral subjects. And that seems Paul's approach, whether it's through the belief in resurrection or through divine grace, that seems to be an even more arbitrary servitude to the inscrutable will of God, right? At least on that reading of the text. So Spinoza seems to suggest that that's the way. Now, when it comes to the philosophical idea of education, right, I think there are also problems. Just as we see blessedness, like the highest good, at hand, right? We seem to be able to finally, with Spinoza's system, have a way to achieve the highest good. We also have, nonetheless, some reasons to question what the philosopher in Spinoza's system has achieved, depending, at least, the different kinds of reasons to question the system, depending on how we interpret Spinoza's idea of the highest good. Spinoza understands the highest good as the intellectual love of God, which can be construed in at least one of two ways. Either the intellectual love of God is understood as knowledge of God's infinite internal nature, or it's understood as knowledge of our finite nature through the infinite nature of God. Now, if it's the highest good is understood as knowledge of God's infinite nature, then our finite nature no longer really matters, because after all, our finite nature doesn't really exist. This is the so-called acosmic reading of Spinoza's highest good. The problem here for us is that the realization of the good, right, that is, in this case, the increased striving of the subject through the improvement of knowledge, no longer makes any sense, philosophically speaking, without the existence of a finite subject in time, which in this reading evaporates, disappears, as it were, in the knowledge of God's infinite and eternal nature. So if the idea of education is that we need a subject who's going to kind of improve his or her understanding of himself and the world through understanding God's ultimate nature, that idea of the subject disappears in this reading of the highest good. And so the whole premise that there's an understanding of the education of a subject seems to be undermined, right? Doesn't seem to work. There was no finite subject to be educated in the first place, right? So what does that really mean? So that's one reading. If, on the other hand, this is again keeping on the theme of the philosophical reading of the highest good. If, on the other hand, the highest good is understood as knowledge of our finite nature through the infinite nature of God, that is, we go to God's infinite intellect and then come back to use that to understand the details of our own finite nature, then we run into what I think are just standard problems of determinism, as Spinoza himself was well aware. So here's the second, take a look at the second passage in the handout. This is number 2. And here we see, as he writes in an early text, the Court of Verhandlung and the short treatise in English, quote, we see then that because man is part of the whole of nature, depends on it, and is governed by it, he can do nothing of himself towards his own salvation and well-being. Right? From this it follows, quote, that we are truly God's servants, indeed his slaves, and that our greatest perfection is to be such, that is, slaves necessarily. Right? That's Spinoza's own account of this. Now, interestingly, Spinoza doesn't seem to see in this text that this is a problem. Now, I think he must realize it's a problem because in the ethics, this idea of being a slave of God disappears, right? We don't have this. We have intellectual love of God, but the language of servitude disappears. But I think that it's kind of arbitrary. Why doesn't it appear in the ethics, given the reading of the way in which our determinate nature seems to be quite the same, determined by God, right? But in the short treatise, Spinoza doesn't see this as a problem, but rather as what he calls an advantage to his system, right? What are these advantages? Well, for one thing, the rational person realizes that without God's help, we, as finite beings, would not be able to accomplish anything. Once we understand that we are in fact slaves of God, then we no longer feel sadness, he says, but rather a joy in accomplishing what we can through the continual aid of God. So, in fact, we should feel good about ourselves, by being, when we're slaves to God, at least. For another reason why it's an advantage is that when we do accomplish something, like let's say learn something, and this idea, we take no false pride in it, for the rational person realizes that God is really doing all the work, right? Spinoza says this specifically. So I'm not achieving this education. God's doing it through me. So yes, I'm the kind of vehicle of this, but I'm just the puppet, as it were, of God's activity. That seems problematic, right? Now, from our point of view, then, at least the way I read it, we might think that these so-called advantages undermine the value of the educational achievement of the rational person. If this is what the rational person achieves through education, right, this is what we've learned, it seems to be problematic. If we as rational persons are slaves to God, then we are only marginally better in kind than the ancient Israelites who accepted the rule of their imagined God and as the condition of their well-being. I mean, sure, we have reason they didn't, but in both cases it ends up that we see ourselves as being subject to some authority that's commanding us in different ways to do things. Moreover, what we come to value in this determined system is not some improvement of our state based on a hypothetical comparison with some other possible state of affairs, but rather the actual state of our striving in the determined order of things, right? Because everything is determined, then what really is good is just the way things are at any given moment. So here's an example. If I happen to read only through part 4 of the ethics, while you guys manage to get through part 5, right? I'm led by reason to judge that nonetheless, I've still achieved the highest good, right? Why? Precisely because the contrary to fact conditional, that I might have been better if I had actually too read through the end of the text, is false, because I couldn't have, given my determinate nature, have achieved that goal, right? And knowing that means that I'm actually satisfied completely with what my current state of knowledge is, right? Whatever that might be. So whatever achievement that I've earned, right? Not only did God really do it, but that um, it isn't really valuable in itself, because every state of affairs is equally valuable in this way of seeing things. Once you arrive at this highest knowledge, that's the claim. Okay, so let's take a look at passage 3 here. And this is my passage, and this is probably very problematic. And so you can take a look at this and tell me what's wrong with it. I'm going to call this problem that I've tried to sketch so far the Spinozistic paradox of education. Right? So what is this paradox? If we are ignorant of something, this is passage 3 in the handout. If we are ignorant of something, then we require the intervention of something external to teach us what we don't yet know. Okay, so that would be, like the Israelites being God intervening into revelation. Yet, as long as the intervention is from some external source, then it always defeats, to some extent, the goal of a philosophical education, which is to direct ourselves through the freedom of mind to rational truth. And that's why Spinoza thinks that the Israelites are not philosophers, and they, whatever education they have is lacking and problematic, because Moses told them this, God has given them these commands, and you can learn what the commands are, but they're not really directing themselves to any particular goal. Now, so that's why it's problematic for them. Nonetheless, when we arrive at the last step of process, so let's imagine now that we're philosophers, Solomon, or even better, Spinoza, who's arrived at this highest good through reason. When we arrive at this last step of the process in which we are finally deemed to be rational, then, as we've just seen, we come to the conclusion from the point of view of God that there's nothing lacking in our natures at all, right? Really. Hence, education, which I'm defining here as the process from moving from a state of ignorance about something, in this case, our own nature in the context of nature as a whole, to a state of knowledge, right, in which we know more, that movement is, in this philosophical vision of the higher good, meaningless, since we always are what we are, and we don't lack anything in our determined being. We just are determined to be the way we are, and what we understand is that whatever we are at any given point, for good or for what might appear is what is the highest good, right? So in this kind of the notion of determinism, okay? Does that make sense to everyone in some sense? So I think that this is kind of what I'm trying to sketch here, is that in these passages, there appears to be a story of progress. And it seems that education is the key. But when you intervene, especially in our understanding of the philosophical nature of education, we realize the nature of philosophical education, we realize that what we wanted from a theory of education is problematic in a variety of ways, right? At least that's what I'm trying to suggest. Okay, now we can see this paradox and its significance a little bit more clearly if we look at another story. I mean, I'm claiming we can maybe understand this a little bit more deeply if we look at another story that's fundamental to the problem of moral knowledge in Spinoza, right? So again, there's a narrative, there seems to be changes that go on, things are good, then they get worse, then they get better, we'll see. So it has a structure of narrative, and it's something that is going to illustrate this problem. And what is that? What is this story? Well, as I said in my title, it's the story of Adam, the first man that we find in Scripture. Okay. And I'm going to come back to the idea that it's a story. Spinoza uses the word historia in Latin to talk about these examples. And so I'll come back to this at the end of the talk. There is a kind of systematic ambivalence or ambiguity in the vocabulary of these stories and examples that he's using. Are they histories? Are they stories? I want you to just keep that in the back of your mind, and I'm going to come back to this in a little bit later. Now, Spinoza mentions, and then discusses this story in multiple places in his text. It's a very important story. For example, it's in the Ethics in at least two places. One, which I'll discuss explicitly in Proposition 68, Scholium of Part 4, which is a really important proposition, and also in Proposition 42, near the very end of the Ethics. He mentions it in the TTP, and I'll talk about that one too, especially in Part 4 on the divine law. And he mentions it in the political treatise. The political treatise is full of discussion about sin and about the story of, and a key moment in chapter 2 on the nature of natural right is devoted to an analysis of the story of the first man. And then also constitutes a crucial part of his exchange with Blyenberg, for example, letters 19 through 24, whatever it is. There's a whole series of discussions about this problem of sin. And, as you read those letters, Spinoza gets increasingly frustrated with Blyenberg, but you see that this theme is really quite important to him there and also in other texts as well. Okay, so what I want to do now is look at two different versions of the story. Well, really, I'll talk about three versions, but I'm going to kind of get into some more detail in two of them. One from the TTP and the other from the ethics. And I also want to talk really briefly about the TP story as well. Now, although every version is essentially the same, I think, in terms of the basic meaning of the parable, there are important differences, at least I'm going to claim, in the presentation of the story. So, which actually matter in terms of the way which we understand it. Okay. There are differences which are instructive in relation to the very thing that I'm bringing up here, the paradox of education that I've just tried to outline. So I think that the problem of what happens to Adam and his education, as it were, um, uh, his moral education that occurs in the story illustrates in a crucial way some of this problematic that I'm trying to discuss. In other words, what I'm hoping, though, is not just that we see another version of this story, but that also maybe in this story we might actually get the outline of what a response to the problem of what's so-called paradox of education would be. Okay, so I'm going to try to derive a response to this paradox from my reading of this story. Okay, so now let's look at passage 4. And then this is the version of it in the TTP, which we find in chapter 4 on divine law, in the paragraph 38 of the text. So it reads like this. The first thing which strikes us in the story of the first man, where it's related that God told Adam not to eat the fruit of the tree of knowledge of good and evil, this seems to mean, what's the meaning of this? It seems to mean that God told Adam to do and seek the good for the sake of the good, and not insofar as the good is contrary to evil. That is, he should seek the good from love of the good and not from fear of evil. For as we've already shown, Spinoza says, and then here the editor of the English translator and editor Edwin Curley gives some suggestions of where he thinks Spinoza might be referring in the text. He who does good from true knowledge and love of the good acts freely and with a constant heart, whereas he who acts from fear of evil is compelled by evil, acts like a slave, and lives under the command of another. So again, we see this kind of contrast seems to be like the ancient Israelites. Adam, of course, is a precursor to the ancient Israelites. He is both, he seems to act like them, but there's also part of the story, as we'll see, he also seems to be able to act, at least in the beginning, out of a true knowledge of the good, not in relation to evil. He falls from this. He gets tempted after he eats the tree of knowledge. He then, from true knowledge of the good, he turns to a fear of evil, which is what motivates him. So this is the fall of Adam and Eve, is that they had this true knowledge, then they are lowered to another state. But then the idea is that there's the possibility of recapturing the prelapsarian state of goodness that was in the Garden of Eden before they ate the fruit of the tree of good and knowledge. Okay, so there is there's a pure state, then the second state is this fall where they become impure and motivated by much more mixed motives, like morally. But then the crucial thing is that there's moral education in the sense that they're able somehow to recover to some degree, or at least be aware of the possibility of recovering the true state of good, the true understanding of good that we have. So this is a kind of complex narrative. that involves a fall from knowledge, and an account of human nature, a fall from knowledge, and then the possibility of regaining some of that purity through education. Somehow this is a narrative in which we become educated and figure out what to do. Okay, now, so here Spinoza in this passage emphasizes the teaching of the divine natural law in Scripture, right, which is represented in Adam's concept of the good without any relation to any concept of evil, right? So the story then also shows, so there seems to be divine law is what Adam knew already from the beginning. But then it also shows that when Adam ate from the tree, he ends up capitulating to his senses. He becomes focused not on the intellectual knowledge of the good, but on what the senses tell him what is good, namely, the pursuit of kind of lower goods, of physical things, etc. And it's this fall, the capitulation to his own senses after having eaten from the tree, that this is what leads to his expulsion from the Garden of Eden and his subsequent struggle against evil rather than simply living according to the good, right? So the drama of the expulsion of Adam and Eve from Eden sets up the problem that as we experience it, of moral life in a world where we are both have some possibility of knowledge of the good, but also have awareness that most of the time we're just afraid of a variety of things, right? Of death, of injury, of harm, of sickness, of hunger. These are the things that motivate us of war, whatever it is. These are the things that motivate us to a high degree. Okay. All right. Now, so that's the kind of account in the TTP. So it seems to be a kind of parable in which there's a conception of the good, a fall from that good, and then the possibility of reestablishing it. And this seems to teach what Spinoza says is the divine law. So it seems to be a kind of rationalistic parable of the law. Yeah. Now, the version of the same story in the political treatise, the Tractatus Politicus, emphasizes a kind of interestingly different interpretive angle in the same story. Namely, that even though originally Adam had a true conception of the good, then it was not, and it was nonetheless, it was still possible for him to fall and give in to some conception of evil that was not native, as it were, to his nature. And from the idea is Adam knew the good. And so why is it that this person who actually had knowledge of the good, how could that person be seduced by the serpent and then eating the apple and go to a lower level of knowledge and then be faced with a kind of the task that we face, which is to try to be good in the face of all these fears and more prosaic problems that we have, right? So even if someone who clearly is depicted as knowing the good, philosophically speaking, if that person could fall, Spinoza seems to want to draw the moral that most people are not going to be led by reason at all. Even if good people like Adam could be seduced by Eve and by the serpent, then the political leader, the statesman, needs to take into account the fact that most people are not going to be led by reason at all. And so state institutions should not, this is the big opening part of the political treatise, should not be led by utopian conceptions of human nature to believe that everyone is good. No, most people are led by their passions and by kind of much more lower state. So political institutions need to be designed to deal with this much baser conception of human beings. So it's the exact same story, but the moral of the story here is kind of different, right? At least compared to the story in the TTP. All right, now, for our purposes, though, it's the third version of this story that's most significant that I want to make something of, and that's the version that we get in the Ethics. And this is number 5 on the talk here, okay? So I'm going to read it out because it's important. This and other things that I've now demonstrated seem to have been indicated by Moses in that story, again, the Historia, of the first man. For in it, the only power of God conceived is that by which he created man, that is, the power by which he consulted only man's advantage. And so we're told that God prohibited a free man from eating of the tree of knowledge of good and evil, and that as soon as he ate of it, he immediately feared death rather than desiring to live. And then, right, after he's fallen, that he found a wife who agreed completely with his nature, right? So remember, this is happening in the midsection of part 4 of the Ethics, as you know. Spinoza has given us an account of how we should seek agreement with other human beings through reason, and they're going to help us more than any other kind of being. So here he's kind of referring to that. The wife is the helpmate who agrees completely with his nature. Adam knew that there'd be nothing in nature more useful to him than she was. But that even after that, right, he believed that the lower animals were like himself, and he immediately began to imitate their affects and to lose his freedom. Okay, so here now we have the story. This is like, again, refers to the story of the golden calf, right? We're suddenly worshiping images, and moreover, the images that we're worshiping turn out to have the animal structure, because we end up imitating animals in a variety of ways. So this refers back to Proposition 27 of Part 3, where Spinoza outlines the imitation of the affects and talks about the way in which we can imitate, of course, ideally other humans. That would be like Adam's imitating Eve, his helpmate, who's like him. But it could also function, as Spinoza points out, to imitate lower kinds of life. We can imitate dogs or, other kinds of beings that are going to have very different motives, but nonetheless, we end up involuntarily doing. So this is the image of the dog or animals, of course, refers to the idea of our baser motives that somehow now Adam, after his fall, has to deal with. Okay, so again, it's part of the story of the fall. But then again, like as we saw in the earlier versions of the story, there's the possibility of redemption, right? And he says, and that afterwards, this freedom, the original freedom, the prelapsarian freedom before he ate the tree, is recovered by the patriarchs, guided by the Spirit of Christ. That is, by the idea of God on which alone it depends that man should be free and desire for other men the good that he desires for himself. So it seems that, well, right, we've fallen, but Adam also, right, opened, because he himself had knowledge of the good, that we could imitate that, right, and follow his example and maybe become good again, right? And so what philosophers have done, including Christ, who's understood as a philosopher, is given us the possibility of, in a way, redeeming our natures through going back to this prelapsarian state in the Garden of Eden. So again, this story is a kind of one of purity, fall, and then redemption is the kind of, and again, this is a kind of moral narrative of growth, of decline and then growth in a crucial way. All right, now the basic structure of this account is the same as we've seen before, but Spinoza adds several features in his commentary, such as the importance of a person, a wife who agrees with one's nature, the fact that once seduced by the serpent, he imitated the affects of animals, thus explaining how he gives into his own sensuous nature, and the idea that rational people will desire to share their knowledge with others, right? Presumably through philosophical demonstration. And finally, that unlike in the political treatises version of this parable, it may be possible for the philosopher, at least, if not for the citizen. So there doesn't seem to be a lot of hope in the political treatise that the average person in the state, could be led by this prelapsarian goodness. But philosophically speaking, in the ethics, that's the hope, that you could be able to achieve this highest good, right? And so all these points seem to reflect a more direct discussion of Spinoza's ethical theory in the Ethics, and they share an optimism regarding the prospects of a philosopher in terms of philosophical education as compared to the ordinary citizen. So the intellectual elite who are reading the Ethics, they at least have the possibility of true philosophical education. All right, right. Now, all sounds good, but now comes in the real problem with this particular text. There's a crucial difference, though, between this text and the way in which Spinoza presents, the context in which he presents it for here and the earlier ones. And so here it is. Take a look at passage 6 in the handout. And the proposition here, that this is the scholium too, reads as follows. If men were born free, they would form no concept of good and evil for so long as they remained free, right? But as Spinoza notes at the beginning of the scholium that follows this proposition, in which the story of the first man appears, quote, it's evident from P4, right? So I think I've quoted P4, that no thing can be destroyed except through an external cause, that the hypothesis of this proposition is false and cannot be conceived unless we attend only to human nature, or rather to God, not insofar now as he's infinite, but insofar only as he is the cause of man's existence. Okay, end of quote. Right, now why is this important? In the other instances of the story that I've cited, the parable seems to be presented simply as the illustration of a natural law or truth of reason. But here, it's framed as a counterfactual, right? It's not a presentation of the way things actually are, but it's a counterfactual. If we read the following hoc in the Latin, which is this translated in the English, in the text referring to the counterfactual, if we read this as referring to the counterfactual, then Spinoza is reading this text not as a history of something that actually happened, but as a story, as something that didn't happen, right, at all. And I think that, right, it may be that this is already implicit in the account of Scripture in the TTP, but I think that it actually is very important that there he doesn't say it. There he kind of presents the TTP as like, this is a story that of something, maybe it's actually a history in some ways. There's it's a problem, but it's a history. And here, though, he's saying it's not something that actually happened. It's a counterfactual, right? And that's crucial. So Adam has an eternal essence that is unconditioned insofar as it's not bound in duration. But insofar as Adam is in the determined chain of finite causes, he is subjected to the influence of external things, including the imagination and the affects. And the reason why Spinoza cites Proposition 4 in Part 4 as the crucial proof text for this claim is because in Proposition 4, in the Scholium, he goes on to say, all things, there is nothing in nature, no finite thing in nature that's not subject to the passions and the affects, right? So don't imagine yourself as being free of that, because all finite modes are. The only being that wouldn't be in some sense is God, okay? So we're all subject to this. In other words, the counterfactual reminds us that this story is not a philosophical allegory, but an imaginative and hence inadequate account that merely resembles and doesn't directly state an eternal rational truth. So I think that in the TTP, he kind of presents this story as this is a statement of a divine truth. But here, he's telling us that it actually represents something that is counterfactually not true, right? So therefore, it has a really different truth status. All right. Now, this is passage 7 here, which is really the crux of what I want to argue, right, in this paper. The contrary to fact structure of this proposition, Proposition 68, is crucial to the solution of the paradox that I established, or at least an attempted solution to the paradox. First of all, we reason that the highest good consists in a determined will. Right? So this is what reason teaches us. A determined will, which is free to the extent that it acts in accordance with our nature. That's part A. That B, that the good is simply equated with our being in the determined world as it is. So whatever our nature, determined nature is good because it's an expression of God in the determinate set of finite modes and in us, and then see that this is the eternal state of affairs as expressed in God's immutable nature, right? So this is how God sees it from the point of view of eternity, what your true nature is at any given moment. It's already in God's intellect as we experience it, right? It was already there. It's eternally true, right? Whatever state of being I happen to be in, okay? All right, now, but on the other hand, though, we can't help but imagine. Now, here I'm going to really emphasize the word imagine. I'm not reasoning here, I'm imagining that due to our finite nature, there's a lesser good. There's a lesser conception. The highest good would be this first A, B, and C. And now I'm going to kind of give you a kind of counterpoint, which is A prime, B prime, and C prime, which are different accounts of what is good. Namely, A prime, that our will is free in the sense that it could do otherwise, right? That is, act in accordance with our own nature rather than the effects of some other nature on me. So imagine Adam, right? On one level, like the prelapsarian Adam, that's A. And the post-lapsarian Adam, after the fall, that's A prime, meaning he now is aware of a counterfactual state in which, right, before things were great. Now I'm in a jam and I want to get back to, I want to will myself to become a better person, not to imitate the animals, not to be affected by them, but to live in accordance with my nature, which I can know through reason. And that idea is the notion that I could will to do otherwise than I actually am at any given moment. Okay? So again, this is the imagination. Reason tells us that's not true, but the imagination tells us this. B prime now is that the good is relative to some imagined evil. So this again is the post-lapsarian Adam who's thinking not only simply in terms of living in accordance with his nature, but I want to live, better than I am now, right? And I can imagine what that better state would be. Right now, I'm just, I'm every night out drinking and, partying. But what I really want to be doing is going to, the Spinoza Society and learning about philosophy. Um, but I drank so much last night that I can barely pay attention and know what's going on. But I can imagine that this would be a higher good, right? It's not my actual good. Right now, I'm just, recovering with a hangover after having been at the bar all night. But I can imagine a better state in which I am studying philosophy. And then finally, C prime, that we can act in time to improve our state. That is, there's some future state of affairs. I'm living in time, and I can use my will, which is A prime, to act in such a way in time to realize the highest good, B, a better good, B prime, which is better than this alternative that I have, in such a way that I can achieve this higher good at some point in the future, right? So I actually make a plan. And then time and history are crucial to this conception because I'm in the world of duration and change. And so all these things make sense. All right. Now, does that make sense to you? I hope a little bit, we'll see. So now you might think, well, why? Where's this come from in Spinoza? Like, does Spinoza conceive of A prime? I mean, it's pretty clear that he conceives of A, B, and C. Does he conceive of A prime, B prime, and C prime? Well, yes, he does, right? Through the imagination. And so here, this is passage 8. And I'm not going to go through all the different things here because I've already taken up too much time. But what I want to show you is that there are multiple passages in Spinoza where he talks about how through the imagination, we are always, empirically speaking, right, thinking in these terms. So even though we know that the will, philosophically speaking, is not free, right, in the sense of being able to act otherwise, the kind of Cartesian conception of a free will, where I have the power to act independently of the determined causal chain. Nonetheless, I conceive of my will in that way, right? Not philosophically speaking, but through the imagination, right? So it's a kind of pseudo-philosophical view of myself for some people. For other people, it's just kind of what they take to be common sense, that I have the power to act otherwise. And Spinoza thinks that this is the case, and I give you some passages as the true. And he also talks about, right, in B prime, this conception of the good relative to some imagined evil, right? And here it's very interesting, and there's a lot to say about this, and I've been trying to write about this as well, in recently. So I could say a lot more about this if you were interested. But the point is that here, um, especially in part four of the preface to part four of the Ethics, he says, as far as good and evil are concerned, they indicate nothing positive in things considered in themselves. They're just modes of thinking or notions that we form because we compare one thing to another. So again, this is B prime. I compare two goods to one another, and then I judge one to be relatively superior to the other, right? That's how it's going to work, right? That's how I'm going to think about it. So there's plenty of evidence that B prime is found in Spinoza's view, and C prime as well. That of course Spinoza conceives of time, right, as a function of the imagination. We create time in order to compare things to one another. At time one, my state was this, it was bad. At time two, it was better. Maybe time three, it'll be even better, or it could be worse. So the narrative structure that we saw in these parables, these stories, the story of Adam, in particular, right, is of course part of the function of the way in which we imagine our activity in the world. It is always understood from, when we're using the imagination, from the point of view of time, right? So each of these different key features of kind of the lesser good, A prime, B prime, and C prime, are all mentioned and discussed by Spinoza. And this is what's crucial. Okay. Now, what Spinoza thinks is that these are what he calls beings of reason, right? And it's a tricky term, and you see it everywhere in Spinoza's work. It's particularly widespread in the early texts, but it's also present in the Ethics as well. He mentions it in the appendix. He mentions it in the preface, something like it in the preface to part four. There are a bunch of places, references in the Ethics too. But what's crucial is it's a tricky word because a tricky term, because he says beings of reason, but really, as he says in the appendix to part one of the Ethics, he says these beings of reason are really better understood as beings of the imagination. So they're things that look rational, right, but actually have a source in the imagination. Does that make sense to everyone? So that's kind of a crucial idea. They look reasonable. They appear, for example, to have a calculating dimension, and what in Hobbes's terms might be called reason. But for him, they only have the appearance or guise of reason. They aren't actually rational, right? And he gives lots of examples of this. And then secondly, right, these beings of reason are usually on the second level of the imagination, as Spinoza categorizes it. They involve signs and complex relations of images that are structured in a particular way. So that's kind of crucial. Now, he provides his most extensive discussion of beings of reason in the early works, in the treatise on the emendation of the intellect, in the short treatise, and in the Cogitata Metaphysica, the short appendix containing his own views that he appended to his summary of Cartesian philosophy. And there's a lot to say about this whole topic. Here, I just want to kind of use one passage in the Cogitata Metaphysica to be able to kind of show you what beings of reason are and how they function in Spinoza's system. And that is in passage 8 here on the handout. And in passage 8, it says that chimeras, fictions, and beings of reason, he distinguishes between these various things, and then he defines beings of reason as, quote, nothing but a mode of thinking, which helps us more easily retain, explain, and imagine the things that we've understood. So they're kind of a shorthand. They're concepts, structures that come out of the imagination that have a function in our epistemic lives, in the way in which we know the world, and also a kind of practical function in that we manage the world in a variety of ways. So the fact that, for example, time is one of the crucial examples of being a reason is really we imagine time and then we create formal structures of time. So we have kind of phenomenological experiences of time, the way we interact with external things, we measure the distinction between one moment and another in relation to the motion of other things and then our representations of it. And then we can affirm we can create artificial time structures. I use a watch, I use a clock, I use my phone to kind of say, here's what the time structure should be. I impose that on the world as an artificial measure of these phenomenological experiences of duration that I'm having. And then we have a formal conception of time. But crucially, Spinoza thinks that all these ideas of time come from the imagination, right? And they are structures that we use. I mean, I need my clock, I need my watch to know when to show up to my class, when to go home, when to pick up, my wife or my kids or whatever from something. These are all crucial practical things. Do they refer to anything really real in the world? Well, maybe only indirectly through the imagined structures that we have, but they're mostly there for practical reasons because they help us explain and deal with things without being fully rational. We're not giving a scientific account of what time is or duration is. We're using the imagination to structure it. All right. Now, beings of reason then have this kind of double valence. On the one hand, they are prone to lead us to error. And Spinoza spends lots of time explaining how these beings of reason are a cause of error. He explains how the imagination and the treatise on the emendation of the intellect takes the guise of reason without actually being rational. And it leads philosophers to accept imaginative generalizations as rational truths when they're not. Right? So that's actually this is in section 19 of the treatise on the emendation of the intellect. In the ethics, so the passage here would be Scholium 1 of Proposition 40 of Part 2. In the ethics, he notes that we have the tendency to produce so-called universals based on the conflation of images. So we have ideas of the nature of a dog based on all my particular images that I've conflated of dogs. And I say, well, I've seen 50 dogs, I've seen 100 dogs. I conflate them, I blur them together, and now I have the idea of a universal idea of dog. And we do the same thing with human beings as well. So these universals are really just bad imaginative generalizations that take the place of what reason should be doing, but for many people end up being what they take to be philosophical explanations, and therefore they lead us to error. If we create a conception of dog or human nature based on the conflation of images of lots of particular humans or dogs, then I have a bad idea, an inadequate idea of what that nature is. Okay. Now, so that's a problem. But on the other hand, as I've just tried to suggest, beings of reason are useful under the conditions of our finite existence. So in particular, like in the theological political treatise, he's aware, of course, that when we assert that we have free will, when sovereigns declare laws on the basis of their alleged free wills, we know that these things don't really exist. From a philosophical point of view, we know that this decision, the will that stands behind the decision, and that things could have been otherwise are really false from a philosophical point of view, right? But notice what Spinoza says, right? This is passage 10, which I think is very important here. He says, we're completely ignorant because we're completely ignorant of the order and connection of things. For practical purposes, it's better, indeed necessary, to consider things as possible. Right? So even though we know that things aren't actually possible from a philosophical point of view, given our inability to give a complete account of the nature of things, we have to act as if it's possible. So these beings of reason, so the idea of a free will in which we can imagine two possibilities and then we choose between them, right? What am I going to eat for lunch? Here are the two possibilities. I'm going to think that one is superior to the other. Why? Because I have some idea of what it means to be healthy or whatever it is. That's going to guide my choices. I know I could eat unhealthily or I could eat healthily. That very idea, of course, from a philosophical point of view, is nonsensical. But that's the way we think of things because we don't have a complete understanding of the causal chain. So we end up using these terms as substitutes for a complete explanation. Okay, right. So however problematic then beings of reason are, they may be useful and even necessary. Okay, so let's go back, and I'm going to come to a conclusion, and show you that this account of counterfactuals, that we have A, B, and C, the conception of what reason teaches us, and then we have the problematic but view that's based on the imagination of A prime, B prime, and C prime. That is the idea of a free will, right? To some degree, the idea of there being alternate goods, some goods being better than others, relatively speaking. And C, the idea that in time we can use the will to achieve those goods. That these are all beings of reason in a way. They're not true, philosophically speaking, but they're useful and maybe even crucial if we want to have a conception of education, right? The education only makes sense under these imagined conditions, right? So here's the idea. The very idea of education, the self-directed improvement of our striving, that is, the achievement of a relatively higher good through an exercise of will which takes place over time, only makes sense from the point of view of the imagination. That is, from an inadequate conception of some lesser good. That's what I'm going to claim. Yet without this inadequate idea, we wouldn't be able to even achieve anything of the higher good as we understand it rationally. So even if we can conceive of it, so we have a conception of A, B, C, that's a rational conception of the good. But we can't do it unless we imagine ourselves in this lesser imaginative state, planning and thinking how we're going to get to this higher state, right? And in order to do that, we need to have these inadequate ideas. The power to act, other than through the imagination, the conceptions of good and evil that motivate our will, and the notions of acting over and through time, these are imaginative ideas, beings of reason that serve as necessary, if not, they're not sufficient, but they're necessary conditions, I'm going to claim, for education, which involves the movement from a lesser to a higher state of knowledge. On the one hand, of course, we know that the imagination leads us to sin, right? So it can lead, like as it did for Adam, to a lower state of affairs, a kind of a miseducation, as it were, of things. To eat the fruit of the tree of knowledge, to conceive of evil as a privation of the good, to imitate the animals, and to give in to our lusts and passive affects rather than living in accordance with reason. On the other hand, the imagination provides the necessary motive for conceiving, contrary to fact, that we could know the good without considering evil, that we can imagine the possibility, contrary to what reason teaches us about our finite power, of reclaiming in time the prelapsarian state of Adam. That is how he was before he, ate the fruit and then was kicked out of the Garden of Eden. So even if we think of the story of the first man now, not as a rational allegory, which I think it's sometimes people are prone to look at it, but rather an imaginatively based parable. It's a parable of education, right? Through the imagination. How Adam was granted certain innate capacities, he lost sight of them through the influence of the imagination and the body, and then he regained them through the use of reason. If we do this, then it treats the acquisition of rational ideas through education, not as a distinct type of education which is simply autonomous, but one that's only relatively less heteronomous than other types of education including those that happen to the Jews. If you look at it this way, how different really is the rational person from what happens? Moses gives us these imaginative ideas that lead the Israelites to improve themselves through the commandments. The philosopher, too, even if to a different degree, also needs these imaginative devices to help him or her arrive at the rational idea. Okay. So I hope in this way that I've addressed, in some small way, the key question that you guys asked me to address today. What's the relation of education to history? There are, of course, several senses of the word history, historia in Spinoza. It could refer to the unfolding of events in time, that is, our experience of striving as understood through the imagination and its various structures. It could refer to the relation of those events to what he calls chronicles, which are just kind of accounts of the unfolding of events. The word history could refer to the effort to compile these chronicles in ways that give them practical and moral meaning for us, these readers. And this, in fact, is the primary sense of biblical history. Biblical history is the use of chronicles for the sake of practical moral purposes, right? So that's kind of history in that sense. But it also could refer to fictions whose only purpose is to narrate stories that don't educate, but simply give us pleasure through distraction. All right, so that would be, Spinoza also thinks about that. He talks about Orlando Furioso, for example, as simply a trifling distraction. My claim then is that education is only possible if we are in an imaginative, constructed history of our striving in time. And we can use stories or historical narratives to make sense of our own moral improvement, even as we see that these stories may, under some interpretations, actually impede our education. So some of these religious narratives actually make us worse, potentially. Spinoza is quite aware of that, right? On the other hand, what choice do we really have, right? They're not fully rational, so they can be used either way. Still, as soon as we become educated in Spinoza's sense, that is, that we become rational through the use of common notions and intuitions, we're going to be struck, I think, by how reason conflicts with the very imaginative conditions under which education is possible in the first place. And that's kind of the conclusion. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you so much for this beautiful, really beautiful presentation, and also for the closure, because me too, I spent some time dwelling on history, story, narrative in Spinoza's thought. So it was really, really interesting, and also the ability to connect all the passages and all Spinoza's quotes about this topic. It was really, really amazing. I think there will be so much to discuss now. So,
Thank you.
if there are any questions,
I saw that some people left, unfortunately. I know I went on too long, but I'm sorry.
no, 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 don't be. Anyway, the talk will be available, on YouTube. So,
Okay, great. Okay.
So may I start? So
Sure.
thank you very much for your wonderful talk, and also thank you for sharing your ongoing research with us. I will try to summarize my notes as neatly as possible, because there's so much to talk about, starting with a fundamental question. To what extent is history, which is one of the main means of education, is history an ens rationis, as good and evil? So as I understand it, you open up the possibility of a precise and deliberate path in Spinoza's philosophy of education, so-called Spinoza's philosophy of education, from the infantile condition of the Jews to the desire to share moral advancement in the ethics. Speaking of the third point of your text, the paradox, the Spinoza's paradox, in my opinion, the problem lies more in the role of the educator than in the subject to be educated. As Spinoza says in the TTP, human nature does not tolerate being governed by its peers. So the educator must be a legislator like Moses. The problem then is that it's not true education, but a form of deception. Forgive my somewhat Straussian or Machiavellian reading. This means that we must remain on a purely imaginative level, that of history, as you pointed out. But does Moses introduce religion in order to be the best possible educator and legislator?
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think it's tricky. Yeah.
Yeah.
So thank you for those questions. I mean, they're really important ones. Yes, I mean, I think that, on one level, I mean, Spinoza himself seems to suggest that Moses is not really educating the Israelites, and he makes a big distinction. He thinks that the prophets are, they're guiding them, maybe, to put it nicely. Deceiving them would be to put it not so nicely. They're being manipulated on some level, right? So that they can be thing. And then he makes a big point of saying that Christ is a teacher. So, that this becomes a fundamental contrast. And so it makes it look as if there's this simple and stark contrast between, yes, the childish Israelites and the mature Christians. There's this kind of supersessionist story where Christianity is the kind of the next stage. If somehow we were able to get there, then we would be able to leave Judaism behind, etc. So I think that that there's a fair amount of textual evidence for this, but I think it's not as equivocal, it's not as unequivocal as people make it to be. So when it comes to reading the TTP, I want to say that it's more complicated than that. So I do accept the fundamental distinction between reason, let's say, and the imagination. The prophets are driven by the imagination and not so much by reason. Christ is the exemplar of a more rational approach to religion, as it were, and that there is a superiority to some degree of the Christian view to at least the simple Jewish view. But I think that's complicated in lots of ways. It's complicated in the account of prophecy. So the prophecy, it turns out that there are some kinds of prophecy which are, bad prophecy, which is really problematic and superstitious, and other kinds of prophecy which is at least compatible, if not derived from reason. So I think that part of what Spinoza is doing is, from a political point of view, is saying, well, yes, insofar as we're political subjects, take the pessimistic reading of the TP that I gave you of the first story of Adam, of the story of the first man, or Adam. Spinoza says, well, yeah, you're going to be a bad leader if you imagine people to be more rational than they are. Your subjects need to be managed, as it were, maybe not through threats always, but through institutional forms of structure, etc. So there are better and worse ways to deal with the fact that people are not always led by reason, and that's kind of crucial, right? So that's one thing. So I think that it's actually more nuanced, and that so using words like deception and the more extreme form of manipulation, that's somewhat misleading, because I think that he thinks that there's a certain I would say genius to the Jewish people, which showed that they actually, at least for a while, created forms of life that were very successful and indirectly were rational, I think, in some ways. So I think that's more complicated. All right, that's one thing. But the key thrust of my paper is really actually about the philosophical education. So my claim is really to use the Israelite story to begin with, and to kind of say, well, yeah, there's a contrast Spinoza seems to be making between the kind of crude forms of religion and then philosophy, and that real education is occurring at the level of philosophy, and that's where we're using reason and demonstration, and we're not involved in manipulating, we're involved in reasoning and arguing and sharing our views and convincing people in this way. And so the thrust of the paper, as I understand it, is to actually call into question that simple idea of what philosophical education looks like. Because on my reading, philosophical education can't be made sense of without the imagination as well. So I'm doing the opposite. My reading of the TTP is kind of to say, well, it's not as bad as it seems. Maybe some of what the Israelites doing or certain forms of prophecy are actually pretty good, meaning they help us. So it's not directly rational, but it's indirectly rational. And that's why prophets are special, right? And that's why Spinoza signals prophecy is an important thing. And then when it comes to philosophy, what I want to signal is kind of the opposite. I want to say it turns out that we can't simply solve all our problems through reason, that even the philosopher has to engage with the imagination in order to solve philosophical problems, right? To educate. So the idea that you can be educated philosophically, that you can move from a lesser state of affairs of knowledge to a higher state of knowledge, even philosophically speaking, I think requires the imagination in the background. And so I think it's a kind of like it's a kind of nuanced view.
Yeah, of
And
course.
that's why that's the kind of the other thrust. So when it comes to reading the TTP, I want to say it's a little bit more nuanced than the kind of stark divide between here are the ignorant Israelites and then the more rational Christians. And I also want to say that when it comes to philosophy, we can't simply we as philosophers who are devoted to using reason can't simply say we're a different kind of being from those people that use the imagination. Because it turns out as finite beings, we also have the imagination. In fact, most of our ideas, even as philosophers, are imaginative. Many of them are. So it turns out that Spinoza doesn't necessarily, he problematizes that to some degree, and he thinks it's an obstacle, but he also, I think, gives us a way in which we can use the imagination to kind of conceive of our own activity as philosophers, that we have to do that, in fact, because otherwise you get caught up in all these problems that I tried to lay out about, determinism, for example. So, why would you do anything if you see things from God's point of view? Because whatever you're doing, I mean, you would do what you're doing, but you would have no reason for complaining or changing or doing anything different. That was the kind of argument there. The only reason why you're motivated to increase your stock of knowledge is, it's not the only reason, it's part of the reason, is because we see comparative states of good. I see that state X I'm less knowledgeable than in state Y, which is more knowledgeable. And that ability to make that relative judgment is crucial to what motivates me as a philosopher to become educated. So I'm trying to kind of motivate the introduction or the use of the imagination in the domain of kind of philosophical education as well. Does that make sense? So I think that's kind of like trying to give you
and
really hit at the crucial issue. And that's the big picture that I'm trying to sketch here.
And is it possible that to some extent this is a way to acknowledge the ethics in a wider way? Returning to the initial question of the ens rationis, is it correct? Is it it's correct to summarize by saying that education remains a paradox until we fully accept that we cannot escape from the imaginative plane. Namely, that's the highest level of understanding, the intellectual love of God, does not negate the use and the function of the imagination. The third kind of knowledge is not a vertical process, but a circular one. Imagination remains immanent to the third kind of knowledge.
Yes, I think it's kind of playing
as an imaginative education is always part of the true philosophical path.
Yes, I think that, yeah, I mean, that I agree with that. And I think that that's right. So it's only kind of at the very, very last stage, as it were, that you would kick away the ladder, where you would really kind of just be one with God. And I think that that was partly the reason why in the beginning I introduced this kind of, there's the acosmic view, which is the kind of very heavy intellectualist reading of what's going on in part 5, such that when you get to that point, you're really not talking about finite things at all. You're only talking about God. And in fact, you have no way to even conceive yourself as a subject in that mode of that interpretation of the intellectual love of God. So you disappear. And that, I think, I take that to be maybe the very end stage, maybe, but not even. I think it neglects just what you were pointing out, the way in which we still have to kind of, there's a thread of our subjectivity, which is imaginatively constituted, that is crucial all the way to the end, until we really die as finite beings. We're trapped in that, and we can use it. Sometimes it's an obstacle, but it's also a motor, right? In the way I was trying to describe, that it creates this dialectical tension within our own educational process to make us, it can function to help us become more reasonable in some ways, not always. I mean, it can mislead us too. So that's what's dangerous about it. But what I want to do is kind of say, yes, reason is in itself produces joy, and that's supposed to kind of drive us from one truth to another. And sometimes like that will be the domain of our experience, but it's really hard to only have that as the motor for self-knowledge, and that knowledge, education in that sense requires also a kind of imaginative background that's not so easy to get. We can thin it, we can make it be more critical about the way in which we use or employ the imagination, but we can't actually get rid of it quite so easily. So we need to use it in the way you were suggesting as part of the mechanisms, and find ways to use it to kind of think about it. And so I take it things like, the very clever verbal strategies that Spinoza uses in part 5. Like, why do we call the intellectual love of God love of God? Why is it love? It's always like, that's very confusing, because love, of course, is just a prototypical passive affect, which you would think would be very problematic to use in relation to the highest good. What Spinoza's doing is he's drawing on both aspects of the word. He's drawing on the kind of the passive dimension of it, because we have experience of that. And he's also now reinterpreting it rationally. And these two things are in a dialectical relationship with each other as we work through the notion of the intellectual love of God. And that brings us, I think that's another way in which he doesn't want to just simply deny that there's an imaginative dimension or register to the word love. He knows that it's problematic, but we can, to some extent, use it to kind of drive our more intellectual process, even in the 5th part of the ethics. So then, yeah, so I agree with you.
Marta, are you there?
Yes, I'm here. Don't you see me?
Yeah.
I'm not an answerazionist. No, I have a
Or
question
maybe
also
you are.
or maybe I am. Okay, I have a question also for Michael. And my question somehow stems from your conclusion, namely that educational perspective only makes sense if it begins from an imaginative one. In fact, many passages Spinoza mentions and uses imaginative tools for education. I mean, for example, if you think about the polysemy of Historia, particularly between history in the proper sense, let's say, and story, Spinoza himself uses anecdotes and stories, especially in the Scholia, I think, in the Scholia of the Ethics. Now, I was wondering, since imagination is that kind of knowledge which we may say is closer to the affects, what is the role of the affects in education? And what is the role of imitation of the affects that Spinoza mentions as an educational tool, particularly regarding children in the ethics? I don't remember the passage because I can never remember the passages like this, but is there an educational use of imitation also for adults? I mean, is there a way in which imitation may also convey a deeper knowledge of ourselves and so be an educational tool? I mean, like some sort of knowing ourselves through the mirroring emotions of others, something like this. What do you think?
Well, yeah, I mean, I'm very sympathetic to each of those claims or statements that you made. And I think that the imitation of the affects is like, it's one of these mechanisms that can be interpreted in lots of different ways. And so I take to be one of the features of Spinoza's theory of affects. I take his theory of affects to have a cognitive basis. So at the root of, there's an affective change which we register through our conatus, but that happens in part through our understanding as well. It's not always so simple because we're composite and we have different kinds of motives at different times and different affects are affecting us. But Spinoza thinks that it's possible to some extent to a limited degree to change our affective states through changes of knowledge, right? So as we learn more about certain things, so I mean, we see this, the easy cases are when, like, so the example I like to use or something like, I made an appointment with a friend to have coffee, and then my friend didn't show up. And I thought that my friend was, I don't know, insulting me or being rude or, I didn't know why he or she didn't come. And then I have an effective response to this. I'm indignant, I'm angry, I'm sad, whatever it is. And then I learned like why they didn't show up. They were sick, they were in a car accident, or, their mother got ill and they had to go help her. And they couldn't call me or whatever. And then when you have that knowledge, it can transform the affects that you have to some degree. So in that case, it's pretty simple. Like if I know that the person wasn't, being rude to me, it was just because something, they got hit by a car or got sick. And then it changes my affective relation, that knowledge that I have on the base. So that's a simple case where that can actually happen. And Spinoza certainly thinks that the ways in which we imitate other people depend on the kind of knowledge that we have of those people. So when you see someone in a movie and they're crying, and then you cry as a result of having seen someone sad in a movie, it may depend. I mean, you may just feel sad, but then if you have some knowledge of their experience, of the at least the story of their experience in the movie, and you can make sense of that in some way, then that may your crying might mean something quite different from someone else that's never had that experience that's crying, because you understand something more deeply about the narrative or the structure of the experience, and so that's important. So I think that that's partly the way it works. So yes, so I think in general, there's this really interesting thing. The flip side is that Spinoza doesn't want to be a Stoic when it comes to the relation of knowledge to affects, meaning he definitely thinks that knowledge is central to our affective lives, but he also thinks that it's not so easy. Simply by having a true idea of something doesn't always change the way we feel, right? So so he thinks that that's true too, and that we learn from experience that even sometimes when I know the truth about something, it doesn't immediately or even ever change the way I feel about something. It might change it a little bit, but not completely. So then he gives us another model in which we have to kind of counterbalance affects with each other, right? So he gives us this kind of economy of affective life. We have to come up with therapies and other kinds of things, which are not simply, now I see the truth and then I just simply change my affective life. I use other things. So it turns out, of course, as you know, that Spinoza's account of the relation of affects to knowledge is extremely complicated, right? And has many different levels. And then so what happens is that, of course, things like mechanisms within that, like forms of the imitation of the affects, which is crucial, who I have sympathy for and who I have antipathy for really can vary a lot. I may have antipathy for people because, I have a prejudice that I got from my parents. And no matter how much I think about it and become aware of it, I can't really get rid of it. This group, I don't, we see this with prejudice all the time, various kinds of prejudice. Even very rational, well-meaning people can't really always free themselves of these prejudices. So we call it unconscious bias or whatever it is. And we say, that's just a fact of my makeup emotionally, psychologically, and also epistemically, that leads me to kind of feel certain things that I know are wrong. And so what we end up having is this kind of interesting dynamic that between these two things. So what I want to suggest, I guess, getting back to the paper, in a sense, is that sometimes, yes, it's crucial to educate ourselves by simply improving our rational ideas. We can make arguments, we can kind of get empirical evidence, we can form theories that are better informed by those evidence, by that evidence, and then that's crucial. But I also think that one of the interesting dynamics, especially because it's so complicated in Spinoza, is also these dynamics that involve not simply replacing imaginative ideas with rational ones. We're not simply replacing imaginative passive affects with active affects. That's ultimately the cure, as it were. But what I'm interested in are these kind of intermediate states where we have to kind of work within our emotional, affective, and imaginative lives to try to improve things without necessarily simply, now I'm a philosopher, I'm not going to have any affects or inadequate ideas anymore. That just doesn't happen, really. So everyone, including philosophers, have to deal with these complex dynamics. And I become very interested in, how those dynamics work, like what is going on in Spinoza's system to deal with that. So I think that's for me, it goes back to you very nicely praised this very, very old article of mine that I wrote here, a long, long time ago now. But I still think that is the crucial issue, which is the Israelites in some ways were problematic, but they were also in some interesting ways good, and trying to figure out how that works, even if they weren't really a philosophical people, which Spinoza thinks they're not, at least in the ancient Israelites weren't. So that actually is very interesting. Like, why were the Israelites relatively better than other people in that time? Why is it that the laws that they came up with, some are, as he points out, no longer relevant at all? And Jews have maybe stuck to these laws in ways that are problematic. But some of the laws turn out to be true. Even if though they weren't philosophers, they were able to arrive at this. So that's very interesting to me, how those dynamic works. And that issue, I think, is not simply related to the Israelites. The Israelites are an exemplar of a much more general human problem, which is how people can be decent even if they're not philosophers, or how philosophers can, themselves, who do have more capacity to be good. I mean, that's why, his account of Christ is also super interesting, or Paul. Paul sometimes really gets it right, according to Spinoza. But then other times he then brings in all these other things which are problematic, like the passages that I quoted in the thing. Wow, God's divine grace, that, at least in some readings, can be very problematic. The mystical redemptive features of Christ's resurrection from the dead. These are, for Spinoza, problematic dimensions of Paul's practice. So even though Paul is kind of the opposite of the Israelites, meaning he's more rational than they ever were, he was himself an Israelite that becomes more rational. So it's kind of interesting what goes on there. He also has a conversion experience, which is also interesting, like what kind of education is going on in this conversion. But the flip side is he's also prone to the imagination. And some of those imaginative functions work well, and others are really problematic because they bring us into all these superstitions that Christians turn out to have as well. And that's kind of the dynamics that interest me.
Thank you. Thank you. After I agree with you, and I'm also interested in that. And after all, is Spinoza's conclusion, no, in the political treatise, when he starts from the point that not all human beings will be rational, so we have to deal with that, starting from that.
Yeah.
And
So yeah, in politics, I think it goes without saying that we have to do that. But then what I'm trying to look at is like, yeah, so even people that are more rational, how do they deal with it? And I think also when it comes to, it's like the analysis of Christianity, I think in Spinoza is very important because number one, the Jews weren't the problem in the 17th century. It was intra-Christian disputes that were the main problem. So he's really trying to diagnose what's going on there. He's trying to be very careful how he's doing it. So yeah, there is an important polemic going on about the Israelites, but there's also a polemic going on about Christianity. Um, and then, yeah, to go back to the theme of the philosopher also has to deal with these imaginative structures. It's not so simple that we can just simply liberate ourselves from them. And that's the end of the story. We just do away with that. I think he just doesn't think that. And that's what makes it interesting. So even from the philosophical side of things, in the ethics, the ways in which the imagination functions, both for good and for bad, is super interesting. And that's what I'm interested in exploring.
Thank you very much. It was truly valuable to hear from you today. I also, as Fior Michele says, I learned a lot. In fact, everything. So, Marta, can we free our guest?
yeah, I think we can free our guest.
Anyway, well, thank you both for
so much for this
yes,
beautiful
thank you
talk.
for organizing it. I mean, we didn't have a big turnout, but it'd be nice if maybe some people got to kind of hear. I'm always happy to respond to questions if people have them. And appreciate you giving me the chance to talk about some of my work and what I'm thinking about.
Thank you for sharing
Thank
it
you.
with
Thank you for
us.
sharing. I mean, it's
Okay. All right.
have
Take
a nice
care.
day.